Imagine finding out that your brother and his children are no longer part of the royal succession, and you are the one who has to deliver the news. That is exactly what happened to Prince Edward. He basically just confirmed that Prince Harry and his kids are out of the active line of succession. And the way it all went down is somehow both way more complicated and way simpler than anyone is saying. The headlines are screaming about a royal earthquake. But when you actually look at what was said versus what happened, the real story is that this wasn't an explosion at all. It was a slow, quiet removal that had been in motion for months. And Edward was just the guy who got stuck holding the folder when the decision finally became public. The thing that gets me is that everyone is acting like this came out of nowhere. But the timeline doesn't add up. Prince Edward didn't raise his voice. He didn't make some grand announcement from a balcony. He just sort of confirmed what had already been settled behind closed doors. And that is where it gets weird. Let's actually start with what Prince Edward said because the wording matters more than people realize. He called it a dreadful shock. He said they were trying to come to terms with it. And then he confirmed that Harry, Archie, and Lilibet were no longer included in the active succession order. But here's what is interesting. He didn't frame it as a proposal or something under discussion. He framed it as something that had already been approved through what is being described as a confidential crown process. That means by the time Edward was speaking, the decision was already made. He was acknowledging a result, and that is a huge difference. The line of succession, which is basically the formal ranking of who inherits the throne, had always been treated as this untouchable thing, like you couldn't just move names around because of family drama. But apparently you can, and apparently they did. And the person who confirmed it was the one royal who never wanted to be in the middle of this fight in the first place. Now, the part that is honestly kind of hard to watch is that Edward didn't feel any triumph about this. His own family moved up the order, which sounds like a win on paper, but the way it is being described is that the gain came through his nephew's loss. And Edward felt that every single time he paused during the confirmation, he had spent years avoiding the fracture between Charles and Harry. And suddenly he is standing directly inside it, holding documents that permanently change where his brother's son and grandchildren stand in relation to the crown. That's not a position anyone would want. And then there is Charles. The king received the confirmation, read it twice, and just set it flat on the table without speaking. That detail stuck with me because it is so much sadder than anger. Charles understood the institutional reason for the change, but he is still a father, and those missing names on the list are his son and his grandchildren. The silence in that room probably said more than any argument could have. But here is the thing that makes the whole situation feel even more off. Edward apparently had a second sealed page in his folder, and when he was asked about it, he refused to discuss the contents. All he would say was that the change involved a deeper question of eligibility. That is when William was summoned. So you have got Edward closing the folder with both hands, Charles staring at the document instead of his brother, and William walking into a decision that could either settle the crisis or rip the family apart behind closed doors. The constitutional language is one thing, but behind it were people who used to sit around the same family tables. And that is what makes this so strange to follow. It is not just about succession rules. It is about a father trying to separate being a dad from being a king, a future king confronting what his brother's removal actually means, and a younger brother who got pulled into the middle because he was seen as neutral enough to deliver the news without making it worse. What is even more unsettling is that Prince Harry apparently had warnings about this months earlier. This wasn't some sudden punishment. According to the palace briefing Edward received, officials had raised unresolved questions about whether someone could remain inside the succession structure while permanently distancing himself from the obligations attached to it. Those concerns were communicated privately, and Harry was given opportunities to respond. So the whole thing was a process, not a snap decision. And when you understand that, the timeline makes a lot more sense. The crisis didn't start with Edward's announcement. It started during a private Windsor gathering months earlier when Harry was confronted with a demand he considered impossible and Charles considered unavoidable. No cameras, no public statement, just one conversation that became the moment reconciliation stopped being emotional and turned constitutional. So here is what happened. Harry was offered a path back into royal cooperation, and he refused the condition attached to it. The palace had been sending him correspondence about his formal relationship with the crown, raising questions about his permanent life abroad, his distance from royal duties, and whether he would remain available during what they call constitutional emergencies. Charles wanted an agreement that would avoid touching the succession entirely. He asked Edward to stay close to the discussions because Edward could speak calmly when emotions threatened to take over. Charles still believed compromise was possible. Harry believed the palace wanted submission dressed up as cooperation. And honestly, when you look at the documents they were asking him to sign, it is hard not to see his point. The king saw a son trying to preserve constitutional privilege while rejecting the duties that came with it. Harry saw a father allowing the institution to place conditions on something he believed belonged to him by birth. Edward watched both men speak and eventually stopped listening because he realized affection wasn't enough to bridge the gap anymore. The Windsor meeting was the breaking point. Charles placed a written declaration in front of Harry and asked him to reaffirm that he remained available for constitutional duties connected to his place in the succession. Basically, it was a formal commitment. Harry read the final paragraph twice, pushed the paper back across the table, and said he wouldn't sign it. Edward didn't move. Charles looked at the unsigned page, then at his son. Harry got up and made it clear he wouldn't let his independent life be tied to conditions the palace had created. After he left, the king said that independence carries consequences when constitutional responsibility remains attached. Neither man raised his voice. That restraint made it colder. Harry walked out, leaving the declaration untouched. Edward stayed beside Charles, watching the monarch stare at the blank signature line. Then William came in, picked up the rejected document, and found the warning buried near the end. Continued refusal could trigger a formal eligibility review. That is when William realized this was no longer pressure. It was a countdown. Months later, that untouched signature line came back between the brothers, and this time there was way more at stake than reconciliation. William had spent months avoiding the conversation because he knew what it might destroy. Harry walked in believing his brother had already chosen the crown over him. No aides, no advisors, just the two of them. The document Harry refused to sign, and a revised succession order that could change their children's futures. This wasn't another royal disagreement. This was judgment inside a family. William had requested the meeting before the recommendation became irreversible because he wanted Harry to hear the consequences from someone who shared his blood. Once the machinery moved forward, personal explanations wouldn't matter. And that is the thing about a succession review. It is the formal process of deciding whether someone can remain inside the order under disputed constitutional conditions. Harry arrived thinking it was still pressure, another attempt to push him toward obligations he had already rejected. He didn't realize how far the process had already gone. William explained the contradiction in the simplest terms he could manage. Leaving official royal work was one decision. Remaining constitutionally available while refusing the emergency responsibilities tied to that position was another. The palace couldn't pretend those two choices fit together forever. But Harry heard something colder. To him, his brother was hiding a family punishment inside institutional language. The argument got sharper when Archie and Lilibet came up. Harry accused William of allowing his children to lose something they inherited by birth because their father chose a different life. William reacted instantly, saying the children weren't being judged for their parents. But he also refused to promise that constitutional status could remain untouched when the responsibility behind it had been rejected. That landed hard. Harry pushed the revised page across the table. William didn't touch it. Then he revealed something Harry had never been told directly. At a private exchange with senior advisors, William had requested extra time before the review advanced. He had argued that his brother deserved one final chance to reconsider the Windsor Declaration. That delay had been granted and the deadline had passed anyway. Harry's anger shifted. William told him the next truth quietly. Charles, not William, had ultimately authorized the review to proceed. The king had waited until the extension expired, then allowed the constitutional process to continue. Harry stared at his brother, realizing he had aimed months of resentment at the wrong person. He asked if their father could stop it. William looked down at the untouched page and said he had already asked for more time once and there was no more left. That is brutal. Harry had blamed the wrong brother, and the person with the real power was the one he couldn't confront the same way. Charles had spent his life preparing to protect the monarchy, and he never expected that duty to require a decision touching his own son's place in his future. The papers were clinical, names and positions and conditions, but the consequences were painfully human. Edward watched Charles read the final page twice. William stood several feet away, saying nothing. Then Charles reached for the pen, knowing whatever happened next would be remembered as both royal judgment and paternal loss. The succession review had moved beyond family argument. Crown advisors had examined the constitutional questions. Legal recommendations had been prepared. Formal royal approval now stood between debate and action. In simple terms, it had become an official test of whether Harry could remain inside the succession structure while rejecting the responsibilities attached to it. Charles knew why advisors wanted clarity. He also knew what clarity could cost him. Edward stayed close because he had witnessed the earlier attempts to repair the divide. He had seen Harry reject the Windsor Declaration, heard Charles argue for compromise, and watched William struggle with the consequences. That made Edward useful as a calmer voice, someone less emotionally entangled than the two brothers. But Edward felt no distance now. Every page reminded him that his own family would move upward if Harry's position changed. Charles read the recommendation again. Approving it would create the clean constitutional answer advisors wanted, but it could also destroy whatever trust remained between father and son. Edward finally asked the question nobody else dared to raise. Can we delay it again? The king looked at him for several seconds. He said extensions had already been granted, and every new delay weakened confidence in the process. William heard the answer and lowered his eyes. His father was no longer deciding whether action would come. He was deciding what mercy could still survive inside it. Then the sealed clause was opened. Charles had preserved one narrow route back. The decision contained a restoration mechanism, a formal path allowing the removed status to be reconsidered if strict constitutional conditions were accepted before the revised order became permanent. William immediately realized his father had kept that option away from public discussion. The monarch was closing the door, but the father had refused to lock it completely. Charles signed. He removed his glasses and placed the pen down. Edward asked quietly if that was final. William said, "It has to be, nothing more," but the meaning was unmistakable. Harry would receive the conditions, and whatever he chose next would belong to him. Final on paper did not mean accepted in the heart. When Harry received the terms, the first consequences arrived immediately. He expected anger, but what caught him off guard was the silence. The revised order was real now. Archie and Lilibet's names were absent from the active succession list, and Edward's family had moved upward. Back in Britain, nobody celebrated. Edward looked deeply unsettled by the position he had inherited through someone else's loss. Charles retreated behind a closed door, carrying the weight of what he had authorized. Harry read the formal notice alone. The revised order had already begun moving through the royal household, forcing officials to change briefing papers, ceremonial planning, and contingency documents used to prepare for sudden constitutional emergencies. That matters because the decision was no longer confined to one painful family conversation. It was being built into the machinery of the monarchy. Harry folded the notice once, then opened it again when he reached his children's names. The pain changed immediately. Harry could accept consequences aimed at him, but seeing Archie and Lilibet removed made the decision feel generational. Then he reached the restoration clause. The mechanism offered one narrow route back, but it required an explicit personal commitment to the constitutional duties he had previously rejected. Charles could forgive him privately. The king could even want reconciliation, but neither affection nor paternal regret could restore the children without Harry meeting those conditions himself. That is the part that really gets me. The crown could define responsibility, but it couldn't dictate every human bond, and Harry chose not to meet those conditions. He accepted removal rather than return under terms he couldn't live with. Edward felt the same weight from the opposite side. He sat with Sophie and admitted that moving upward brought no sense of triumph. Their family now carried greater constitutional significance, meaning more attention, more responsibility, and a stronger expectation of readiness if the crown ever required them. Sophie understood immediately why that burden felt bitter. Edward's gain existed only because Harry's branch had been pushed away. "This doesn't feel like moving forward," Edward said after removing his glasses. Sophie answered quietly that perhaps it was not supposed to. Charles withdrew after signing the decision. The monarch had achieved the clarity advisors demanded, but the father inside him now faced the silence that followed. He knew Harry had received the terms. He also knew that forcing another conversation might only make the wound deeper. Catherine saw the danger before William admitted it. She urged him to contact Harry one final time, not as heir, not as defender of the crown, but simply as a brother. William resisted at first. Too much had already been said through documents and deadlines. Catherine reminded him that this was exactly the problem. William finally agreed. No aides would attend, no papers would sit between them, no constitutional language would be allowed to hide what either man truly felt. The institution had already spoken. Now, two brothers had one final chance to decide whether the family could say something different. For the first time since the crisis began, there was no document on the table. No private secretary waited outside with talking points. No constitutional advisor could interrupt. William and Harry sat alone as brothers, not as heir in exile, and the absence of palace machinery made the conversation more painful rather than less. William finally admitted he had feared losing Harry long before the succession changed. Harry answered with something equally difficult. He had feared returning would mean losing himself. William had arranged the meeting that way because Catherine believed every previous attempt had failed the moment official language entered the room. Harry already understood that the restoration conditions remained available, but accepting them meant renewing formal commitments to the crown. Those commitments would bind him again to constitutional duties, the responsibilities expected from someone who still held an active place in the succession. William spoke first. He said he couldn't ask his brother to return to a life he no longer wanted, and he wouldn't pretend that leaving had been easy. But the future king also refused to treat constitutional responsibility as a decoration. A place in the succession carried expectations, even if the person holding it never came close to the throne. Harry listened without interrupting. This time there was no official language to hide behind. Harry answered with the truth William had feared. Protecting his family's independence mattered more than preserving a position he never expected to inherit. He didn't want Archie and Lilibet raised under obligations he had spent years trying to escape. The decision hurt, but returning simply to recover status would feel like surrendering the life he had fought to build. Then Harry reached across the table. William had left the restoration folder unopened between them. Deliberately refusing to pressure him, Harry placed one hand over it and closed it completely. "Leave it closed," he said. The prince looked at his brother and understood immediately. Harry would not challenge the revised succession arrangement. He would not sign the Restoration Declaration merely to recover rank. He would not ask Charles to reverse the decision through private affection. William nodded, but one promise remained. Whatever happened constitutionally, Archie and Lilibet would never become lesser members of the family in his eyes. Harry looked at him for several seconds before quietly accepting that distinction. The crown could define responsibility. It could not dictate every human bond. That agreement changed the crisis. What had begun as resistance now became acceptance, and once Harry's choice became known, the argument escaped palace walls entirely. By morning, the story belonged to breakfast tables, television studios, crowds outside palace gates, and newspaper stands across Britain. Some saw discipline, others saw cruelty, but almost everyone understood the same thing. A line that had seemed fixed by birth had suddenly become emotionally charged. Edward's quiet confirmation was now the defining royal story of the day. One image outside Buckingham Palace captured the national mood better than any official statement could. Edward watched the coverage beside Sophie and grew more uncomfortable with every hour. Broadcasters repeatedly explained the revised succession order, the formal ranking that determines who stands next in line to inherit the crown. Correspondents focused on his unexpected role in confirming it, and some commentators called him the biggest beneficiary. Edward rejected that language immediately. Sophie heard him say that no one in their household considered another branch of the family being removed as victory. The argument spread quickly. Some believed anyone remaining inside the succession should accept meaningful constitutional responsibility. Others insisted that hereditary position should not be altered because of family conflict or disagreement over royal duties. Edward understood both reactions, but he knew the television debate was stripping away the private pain behind every name. Sophie reminded him that the public saw movement on a list. They did not see the conversations that had broken the family before the list ever changed. Outside Buckingham Palace, the reaction became painfully concrete. A small crowd gathered near the railings as newspaper sellers held up a front page dominated by 3 words: "Harry out, Edward rises." One woman read the headline, folded the paper quietly, and lowered it without speaking. Another raised her phone and photographed it. The moment captured the divide perfectly. One royal future had been reduced to a headline, while the emotional cost remained invisible. Charles heard something worse. A broadcaster described the decision as a king choosing the crown over his son. The king reached for the remote immediately and switched off the television. He did not challenge the words. He did not defend himself. He simply sat in silence, knowing that whatever constitutional reasoning existed behind the decision, millions would remember the story in painfully personal terms. Then the palace released the confirmation that ended the speculation. Through a documented official statement, it was made clear that Harry had chosen not to activate the restoration process. He would not sign the conditions required to regain active succession status. The choice was now his as much as theirs. Edward read the statement beside Sophie and understood that the movement was permanent. Charles understood it too. The rankings were now settled. What remained was the harder verdict, the human cost hidden behind those newly arranged names. In the end, there was no triumphant winner. Edward moved closer to the crown without wanting another man's loss. William protected the constitutional future he had been raised to inherit, yet watched his brother step farther from it. Charles secured the clarity his advisors demanded, but paid for it as a father. And Harry made the most personal choice of all. He accepted removal rather than return under conditions he could no longer live with. The succession was clearer. The family was not the same. Edward accepted the new reality without celebration. Inside his own household, he made it clear to Sophie and his children that moving higher in the succession did not mean gaining a prize. It meant greater constitutional importance, stronger expectations, and a heavier duty to remain ready if the crown ever required them. Sophie understood why he spoke with such restraint. Their family had moved forward only because another part of the family had stepped away. Harry made his own decision just as firmly through a documented formal response. He declined the restoration pathway and accepted that independence carried permanent constitutional consequences. The restoration pathway was the final mechanism that could have allowed his active position to be reconsidered if he accepted renewed obligations. He chose not to. Archie and Lilibet would remain outside the active order. But Harry believed protecting the life he had built for them mattered more than recovering a place in a system he no longer wished to serve. William understood the cost from another direction. The prince had protected the future structure he believed the monarchy required, yet nothing about that achievement felt like victory. His final private conversation with Harry had not repaired everything, but it had prevented constitutional disagreement from becoming total personal rejection. He could not restore his brother's place without conditions. He could still refuse to treat him as someone erased from the family. Charles carried the hardest reminder. The king returned alone to the unsigned Windsor Declaration that had triggered the entire crisis. He touched the empty signature line once, then placed the document inside a private drawer. He did not destroy it. That choice mattered. The monarch accepted that Harry would not return under those terms, but the father refused to erase the evidence that reconciliation had once been attempted. Edward's confirmation now meant something larger than movement on a list. Birth had created a place in the succession, but in this chapter, continuing responsibility determined whether that place remained active. Harry chose independence. Edward accepted an unexpected burden. William accepted the loneliness of inheritance. Charles learned that even a king could not preserve every bond while protecting every institution. Edward's announcement changed the order of names, but its deeper legacy was painfully simple. The crown endured because each man finally accepted the price of the life he had chosen, and that made the decision final.